Dobry Tubinielos. So, as I advertised, one of the most enduring myths of the last 20 years is that Ronald Reagan won the Cold War. But this is not only false, it's not only a deliberate political strategy for one American party to win elections, but it's a concerted attempt to rewrite history. Now, I don't believe my little video here, or all of them put together for that matter, can overcome this, but what I will try to do briefly here is demonstrate that not everyone, at least, is fooled by this propaganda despite its best efforts. The gist of this myth is that Reagan defeated communism by ratcheting up the arms race, causing the Soviet defense budget to expand beyond its capabilities, that his bold initiative sabotaged the Soviet bloc economy with trade restrictions, that supporting dissidents pressured the Soviet state to open up to democracy. This line is maintained because most people hearing it had then, and still don't have, any idea of what was really going on in the USSR by 1980. All the initiatives associated with Gorbachev, Glasnost, Perestroika, and so on, were actually the brainchild of KGB chief Yuri Andropov back in the 1970s. This was, as you may recall, a time of détente, of expanding trade with the West, but expanding these avenues further were blocked not just by Reagan's election in 1980 and ratcheting up the Cold War, but by the World War II generation in the USSR, symbolized by Brezhnev, that refused to change, but also refused to retire or die. If the Soviet leadership of that generation had passed, naturally or otherwise, before 1980, from the scene or just handed the torch to a newer generation, we'd have seen Glasnost, Perestroika, the whole bit begun before Reagan ever took office, as a response to the USSR's own needs, not to the arm twisting of the U.S. Similarly, if Chairman Brezhnev, of the same generation as Ronald Reagan, had had Reagan's good health, he could have hung in there for a few more years and the USSR would have continued as the same old Soviet Union for that much longer, despite Ronald Reagan. Reagan, in fact, represented old thinking just as Brezhnev. And the original genius of Perestroika and Glasnost was that it endgamed both Reagan in Washington and hardliners in Moscow by sidestepping the Cold War, taking a cue from London's original Soviet Peace Manifesto of 1917 and calling for an end to World War I. Reagan grandstanding at the Berlin Wall, demanding it be torn down, nicely obscures the fact that Lavrenti Beria, Stalin's original heir, offered to disband the entire East German state in 1954 for a united, neutral Germany, rejected by the U.S. because of its plan to integrate West Germany into NATO. Reagan's deficit defense spending was all about keeping the military-industrial system and its contractors working, rich, and happy. Proof of this is his determination to go ahead with the Strategic Defense Initiative, the Star Wars program of outer space deterrence. That was impractical but necessary to keep high-tech contractors working around the clock. Similarly with his program of battleship production. Naval battleships were floating dinosaurs by 1980, but Reagan continued them because to one of his generation a strong naval fleet was a sign of prestige, and because their production and maintenance was simply too profitable for too many contractors to abandon. Soviet leaders were as aware of this as Reagan's domestic critics. The deterrence factor in this buildup was greatly overrated, but also by the Soviet military, as well as by Reagan, which under Brezhnev was acting like a state within the state and pursuing its own policy, as its quagmire in Afghanistan plainly showed. So it was not Reagan's tough talk, nor his subsidized proxy wars in Central America, Angola, or Afghanistan that rolled back communism. Rather, it was the peace process initiated by Gorbachev. The opening to democracy is seen in elections in Poland, Hungary, and Nicaragua. Not Contras, not special ops. In the end, it was not Reagan's bloated defense budget, its high-tech war toys, but the nonviolent mass action of thousands of ordinary people demanding freedom and democracy and human rights. These protesters in Tiananmen Square, in Leipzig, in East Germany, to the streets of Moscow, gave the lie to all of Reagan's assumptions and policies. And yet his supporters still have the gall to claim that Ronald Reagan won the Cold War. Another covering lie by professional liars, told for a president who left office in disgrace as his Iran-Contra subversion program dissolved with the rest of his ideology. In fact, Tiananmen in China did much more to seal the defeat of international communism. The Chinese Communist Party saved itself because it was willing to fire on unarmed protesters. Precisely because of that action, the East European parties were put in the position of either following suit and disgracing all their announced reforms or giving in to mass demands. When the old leaders did not bow out willingly, as in Romania, they found themselves at the wrong end of the gun. Because, as Hosni Mubarak and other Arab leaders have learned in this go-around, in such situations you either shoot or surrender power. An autocratic government has no other choice. The Tsar fell in February 1917, precisely because he was caught in the same dilemma. The Soviet bloc began its dissolution precisely for the same reason, taking finally the USSR and Gorbachev too. This was a momentum of East energy building long before Reagan ever trod the White House steps. And if not mismanaged by Gorbachev's own cult of personality and his flip-flopping decisions, and such strategically bad choices like giving the Russian Republic its own separate structures that his rival Boris Yeltsin could take over, things might not have resulted in such a sweeping defeat of himself, his beliefs, or his state. In all this, Ronald Reagan was no more than a bit player, not the star of the show as his posthumous promoters would have it. Yet, precisely because it's a nice, happy-ending fairy tale, as were his other roles, it is necessary to feed the public as a Hollywood musical in the Depression to keep the masses thinking right, and not for themselves. Obviously, this is a subject that can only be touched on in the context of a YouTube video, but it has, I hope, opened a few younger folks to the blatantly false and mendacious propaganda spoon-fed to them by the established world of academia and the media. Well, I was expecting that. Hello? Adolf Hitler again. And do you want our viewers to know that the fall of Bolshevism validated all you tried to do for Germany and Europe? That even when you were whispering in Reagan's ear at Bitburg Cemetery? Well, sorry to tell you. But Reagan was as big a flop as you, Herr Fuhrer, and for the same reason. Because in the end, people want to live, not die for some leader's false sense of glory. Well, he lives it up behind closed doors.